sorry about that. I just kind of lost it there for a bit.
Glitch.
Yeah, my fingers are so sore. Anyways, continue.
I forgot what I was saying.
Hey Jude.
Hey Jude. Yeah, I remember 1968. I think because that was kind of one of their quieter songs that it got a lot of radio play that we were able to hear that one. It wasn't until probably the early 70s that I really started collecting behind my mother's back, collecting record albums from different places and hiding them.
Gotta do what you gotta do.
Yeah. Well, Dad was a preacher, and Mom was uber religious, and
uber.
Yeah.
Loved how you use that.
Yeah. Well, she was, still is, and so we lived in very strict household. And so to get away with anything like that, you had to think it out. Take care of the details, the small details. But
was there anything else that you remembered from the 60s when you turned on the television?
Oh, I remember my dad used to watch the news every night. So, you know, even though I was a kid and I got bored with it fairly quickly, I remember seeing things that were going on, stories about Vietnam. I remember seeing stories about the hippies in California, which at that point is where we lived, actually not very far from where a lot of this was going on. So we saw our fair share of hippies. I remember one time when Hell's Angels, the original Hell's Angels, not the nice guys you have now, the older guys, but the original Hellions, Hell's Angels, came through town.
The real bad guys.
Stopped traffic everywhere. And they were right down the middle of the road, downtown, both sides of the road, and everybody. It was like a giant, scary parade. Because no town wanted them to stop in that town because trouble started. So, yeah, I can remember things like that happening.
Well, do you have any specific reactions on any of these events you just mentioned? Like any particular...
Well, like I said, you know, in the 60s I was pretty much 2 years old to 12 years old. And in those years, you see those things as being outside of your universe. And every once in a while something steps into it. But for the most part, when you're a kid, it's all about getting a new bicycle with banana seat. I love that. Or playing tetherball, or having something foolish interrupt your television viewing, which to me, I mean, you know, to a lot of people, a man on the moon was a miraculous thing. It was a wondrous thing. I remember how astounded my parents were, and even my older brother. It was an absolutely amazing thing. To me, it was amazing for about 10 minutes, and after that, it was interrupting my television viewing.
Your Saturday morning cartoons.
Everything. Because unlike you guys nowadays, we only had like 3 major channels and an occasional UHF channel.
Ugh.
So when something took over all 3 channels, that was it. There were no video games. There was no VCR. There was no... Well, you could just turn it over to something else and watch, or you could just, you know, switch one of your hundreds of channels that you have. You had 3, and when they were taken over, that was it. You missed out on all your shows. And at, you know, 10 years old, that was really kind of irritating.
And yet, when I have my 200 channels nowadays, I still can't find anything on.
Isn't that typical, though? Yeah. Isn't that something?
So, if you were a child in the 60s, then you must have remembered more in the 70s.
Oh, yeah. I suppose. A lot went on in the 70s. The typical teenage angst, and, you know, the 70s were kind of dull at first, but at the end they were very exciting because, of course, I was an older teenager. I graduated in 1976.
Do you remember?
Bicentennial year.
Do you remember some of some of the key events that happened in the 70s and your reactions on them?
You probably talking politics, like Watergate. Again, I just discovered soap operas and they interrupted all of my soap operas. It irritated me.
Completely indifferent to politics, aren't you?
Yeah, oh, at that time, I could care less about politics. I still at that age did not see where it affected my life all that much, one way or the other. Other than you know. And as far as opinions on politics, when you're a kid, whatever your parents think, that's pretty much what you think. You don't really know why, but if your parents are really vehement about a specific political structure or person or whatever, then that's, if that's the guy they want for the president, then he's probably the right guy, and you're for him too. You don't know why, you don't really care why, but that's where I was. It just, whatever they said, I believed it. They must know better than me.
Kind of surprises me, considering that you were kind of a rebel of a person to begin with your parents, and so you didn't really, as a teenager, really get vehemently screen with politics or anything.
I had certain things that were important to me. I was a rebel where it was important. If it was boring, like politics were to me, I wasn't so much of a rebel. I accepted pretty much what they said as far as that was concerned. Music, on the other hand, that was my thing. I had my own ideas about music, and I didn't really appreciate them putting religious overtones on, whether people were good or bad, but that's the way my parents were. Everything had religious overtones.
You were finally able to vote once you graduated out of high school, or several months after graduation. So, what were your thoughts about the importance of voting?
Well, I think that's when I had just started to really start paying attention to politics and who stood for what. Up to that point, I pretty much just listened to my parents and what they said.
Yeah.
And when I realized that it was now up to me to make my own decision, I guess the radical at that point emerged.
Burgeoned?
Yes. Because in quite a few things I found myself not in agreement with my parents as far as they were very conservative.
So around the time of the bicentennial, who was running for president?
Oh,
when you first voted?
You asked me that. I was graduating high school. I had more things to think about than that. And besides, that's been so long ago. Let's see. That was... You know what? I don't remember. I remember... let's see.
Do you remember any presidents
I remember when Johnson took over. I remember when Nixon... the whole Watergate thing. My parents voted for Nixon, by the way.
Oh, I saw that coming a mile away. Definitely.
I remember Reagan was their absolute favorite. They loved Reagan. I remember Jimmy Carter.
Who do you think would be...
Which is unlikely, because who really remembers Jimmy Carter?
Well, certain teacher in American Studies is making us try to remember him, so there you go.
Good luck on that one. I wasn't there. I remember his brother was like a big joke, but I remember that he was a peanut farmer. If that's of any interest, it might help. I don't know.
But who do you think was, of all 44 presidents, counting the ones of today, who do you think would be your favorite or stand out as the best among the rest?
Oh, that's a hard one.
Shush, Jenna.
Because the thing about presidents, there's a lot of glitz and gloss that goes on in politics as far as making each one of them seem like the perfect person to lead our country, but they're all human beings, and they all have their faults and weaknesses. And as far as the presidents of the past, I can only go with their press. Actually, the presidents of nowadays, all you can go with is their press, you know. So it's really hard to say. I would say probably, I don't know. That's a really hard question.
Well, I think the quality of a president is based on his actions, more than his stances, in fact.
And then that would go back to Abraham Lincoln, then, wouldn't it? I'd have to stretch pretty far back. Although I'd have to say that John F. Kennedy, who my parents did not think that much of. On the other hand, I think a great deal of some of his stances and some of his actions were, to me, very laudable.
Like what?
That's hard to say without getting into a lot of political...
Nothing simple, nothing like a single incident?
Well, yeah, that's a hard one. Let me think. It was pretty much his stance of
like usually in a president's term, something happens. There's an incident. There's some sort of political movement. There's war. There's social movements, and usually the president has some kind of influence on what goes on.
He took a stand against a lot of the political games that a lot of other presidents succumb to.
Mhm.
I'm going to try to put this as blandly as possible without any of my conspiracy theories coming out. I know how you are about that, and you do not want me to go into that. I know you don't, because you yell at me when
Magic bullet.
So I'll just say that he did not fall into that trap. He refused to. He was very open about some things that probably a lot of the others did not appreciate him being open about, and we're not going to go any further into that because, again, we're going to be getting into conspiracy theories.
Well, I think the thing about political games is, I think, something that a lot of people can agree with, because everyone knows that, about politicians and their games, and how it's all just a race to get to the top and stay at the top, and
Amen.
Just exactly.
It's all about the re-election.
Exactly. I think a lot of people can agree with that.
Oh yeah, I do.
But I mean, during the 60s and the 70s, and probably well into the 80s, there were a lot of social movements, radical social movements. There were civil rights groups. There were people trying to change the very foundation that they've been raised with for decades, centuries even, probably, if you think about it.
There was the women's movement, there was the racial movement, there was the peace movement.
Was there anyone you particularly identified with and really kind of took more to heart than other movements?
At the time?
Yeah.
No, I was way too young. I understood a lot of what was going on, but at the same time, being there at the time, I saw the violence that came out of some of it, the mistrust, there was just the mindset of so many people. People were really divided. It was a time where people were trying to come together, but the whole Beatles come together, but they were really divided because there was the old world that was set in its ways, and there was the new ideals that were threatening those old ways, and so there was a very it was very divisive at that time. There was this group against this group against this group, and nobody,
So do you think there's one that you identify with now, as in you think it was a good thing that this social movement came into place, or these particular set of ideas or thoughts?
Well, I think all of them, to some degree. Not to every degree, but all of them had merit. I mean, there was change needed. There was reform needed. As far as the feminism movement, I don't agree with every direction that they've taken, but the basic tenets of equality, yeah. Equality as far as races go, yeah, I agree with that. As far as, the whole equality thing, all men are created equal. That came out way back 200 years ago, and yet it seemed like it took 200 years for it to finally dawn on people what that meant. All men, that includes women, it's the general term, all men are created equal. And why did it take us 200 years before we even began to understand what that means? So.
Good point. So I think we're going to conclude this with just a single question, just one more question. If you were born in any other generation in the 20th century other than being raised in the 60s and 70s, how do you think it would be different? Say if you were raised in the 80s or the 90s or the 30s or 40s. Do you think it would be different as a person?
If I was raised by the same parents, absolutely not. My parents no, my parents are still the same now as they were back then as far as their viewpoints and their idealism, and they're very, very idealistic, very strong-minded individuals.
But do you think...
And they would have raised me exactly the same way, and I don't see how the events of the world would have changed.
But do you think that the 60s and 70s brought you up in a particular set of mind? Did they influence you in any way that made an impact on your life?
Oh, I think in that, probably the only difference would have been the amount of technology involved. That's the only real thing I can think of, because like I say, my parents are strong-minded individuals, and they would have raised me exactly the same in any particular time frame. But technology, I think to some degree I've benefited from remembering a time before we had this extensive technology, where things were more simple and we knew how to do, we remembered how to go outside and play and enjoy and the games that, the whole neighborhood full of kids would get together and come up with, because that we were limited as far as television. And
you had 3 channels.
Yeah, and plus we had stricter parents. We were only allowed to watch so much, and it was black and white, and it was kind of boring, and there, news came on at 6 o'clock, and that's all there was, and who wants to watch that? So let's go out and play, so. So
that would be your message toward kids of this generation: go outside.
Yeah, kind of. Technology is a great thing, but it's not the end all. There are things out there to be enjoyed in one's imagination. Just being able to use your own imagination instead of depending on somebody else's can be a good thing.
All right. Well, thank you for this interview.
Welcome. Am I off now?
No. Is there one more thing to say? Anything you want to say? Peace out,
No, now you know me. That's not my style. I don't do so. It's just
4 past the 7.
Bye.
Right?
And Jenna says hi.
Bye.
I still love you stuff, baby.
Oh my God.